because just a few years after Governor Winthrop utters these words about being a city on a hill, just a few years later, the people in the city on a hill move out to massacre the Pequot Indians, who seem to think they belong on this land. And there's a description of that, which was William Bradford, one of the early settlers in Massachusetts at that time, a contemporary of Winthrop, wrote a history of the Plymouth Plantation, and he talks about how, the Captain Mason, attacking a Pequot village, said, we must burn them, and then Bradford reports, those that escaped the fire were slain with a sword, some hewed to pieces, some run through with their rapiers, so as they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It is conceived that they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave prayers thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, and given them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy. And very early on, there's an association between what the government does and what God approves of. In that process of not being just a city on a hill, but of moving out, of expanding, continued. That's a persistent fact of American history, going all the way back to those first settlers and coming down to the present day. The persistence of expansion into somebody else's territory and occupying that territory and dealing harshly with the people who resist that occupation. And one of the things that when you study the American Revolution in school, one of the things they don't tell you, although we know about the good things of the American Revolution, independence from England and the Declaration of Independence and all of that, but generally they skip over the fact that independence from England for the colonists was disastrous for the Indians, because it meant that from now on the colonists who had been restrained by the British in their proclamation of 1763, setting a line, a boundary within which the settlers were supposed to stay so as not to encroach into Indian territory, this boundary line was now erased. And now the colonists, now with the revolution victorious, with independence from England, the colonists could move westward into Indian territory. And of course that process continued on and on, with the kind of description that you heard of the Pequot massacre occurring again and again in American history as we moved across to the west coast and down to the Gulf of Mexico. And this notion of God being involved, this notion of being sort of divinely ordained, that notion continued. In the middle of the 19th century, on the eve of the war with Mexico, when the United States had just annexed Texas. A lot of Americans don't know that Texas was just part of Mexico. A lot of people in the United States don't know that California was once part of Mexico. They wonder, why do they have all these Spanish names out there? San this and Santa this and San... Yeah, well... but on the eve of a war with Mexico, this famous phrase was coined by a writer and editor named John O'Sullivan. He spoke about manifest destiny. He said it was our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Providence, God, continue to be involved in expansion. When the United States went into the Philippines in the beginning of the 20th century, President McKinley, some of you may know this because it's not everything that I say to people is an obscure fact, and sometimes I tell people that they really know. Maybe often I tell people things that they really know. Sometimes I think everything I tell people is something they really know, but I say it anyway. And but you may have heard that McKinley said that the decision to invade the Philippines came, one night, when he prayed, and God told him to take the Philippines. And so this is a very dangerous kind of idea. Once you have God's permission to do what you want, you need no criterion of human morality. And with President Bush, if you don't mind me skipping immediately a lot of American history to President Bush, it's well known that Bush has a special relationship to God, and that Bush invokes God every chance he gets. He's not the only president. I mustn't be too hard. He's not the only president who does this. The invoking God is a very common thing all through American history, but Bush has made a specialty of it, and Now I'm going to tell you something where I don't know if this is true. Not all historians will admit that the things they tell you may not be true. But it sounds true to me. How's that for a scientific bit of evidence? And that is an article appeared in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Any of you remember an article that appeared in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, in which the reporter talks about talking to Palestinian leaders who had met with Bush? Okay. Finally, I'm telling you something that is not only fairly new, but dubious. But according to this reporter, he spoke to this Palestinian leader, and the Palestinian leader reported on his conversation with Bush, and as he reported, Bush told him, God told me to strike at Al-Qaeda, and I struck them. And then he instructed me to strike at Saddam, which I did. And now I am determined to solve the problem in the Middle East. Well, as I say, who knows? Well, it's one of those situations where you get something second and third hand. It's just that it's plausible, knowing Bush. It's, whether it's true or not, it's plausible. It fits everything else. This now I'll give you a piece of evidence which is, I think, more credible. That is, it's closer to home. This is the president of the Ethics and Religious Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, a friend of Bush, and says that Bush told him during the election campaign, quote, I believe God wants me to be president. Now, I would consider that interference in a free election. And God wants me to be president. Now, this actually was reported in the newspaper, and this man, Richard Lamb, who says that Bush told him this during the election campaign, he resented the fact that it was quoted, I believe God wants me to be president, but it was quoted out of context. Context was that Bush followed this up by saying, but if that doesn't happen, it's okay. Well, I thought, yeah, that's reasonable. He's, willing to change his mind if God changes his or her mind. Okay. This idea of God giving strength to whatever the government does is something that is true, not just with Bush, but at the higher reaches of American government, the people around Bush, and Justice Scalia. Justice Scalia, I don't know how closely you watch him, but this is an aside because I just got this in the mail today, and that was something, a publication of the Dramatists Guild in which they have they reproduce a talk that the playwright Tony Kushner gave at Bard College, and it's all about Scalia. But that's just an aside. Scalia seriously believes that God is the source of governmental power. And he has said this again and again. And he spoke in, 2 years ago at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He said, government is the minister of God. Government derives its moral authority from God. And this is a dangerous idea in anybody's hands. Scalia seems to be overlooking the fact that the Declaration of Independence suggests that government gets its authority, excuse me, from the people. That's what the government gets its authority from the people. It's answerable to the people. If the government doesn't make sure that people have an equal right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, it is then the people who have the right to, as the Declaration of Independence says, to alter or abolish the government. But I suppose Scalia is a strict constitutionalist, and the Declaration of Independence is not part of the Constitution. In fact, the Declaration of Independence is not a legal document at all. It's just, the most idealistic statement that to come out of the American Revolution, and one to be put aside as soon as you win the revolution. So this idea of God being the source of governmental power, it's always dangerous in anybody's hands. It's dangerous when people call themselves the chosen people. It's dangerous there too. But if these people don't have a lot of power, there's not much they can do with that. They can sort of enjoy the fact that they are the chosen people. If there's some point in history where they develop the power to do something to somebody else, then it becomes serious. And we've seen then there are people who in Israel who have who justify the occupation of the West Bank on sort of very pragmatic grounds of security and self-defense, but there are others, there are religious fanatics who justify the occupation on the basis of, yes, being the chosen people and being chosen by God to do this. Of course, there are important people, important Jews who have opposed this idea of calling themselves the chosen people, considering what terrible things have been done in the name of being selected by God. After all, the Nazi stormtroopers had on their belts Gott mit uns.